Imagine trying to fall asleep after a long day at sea, but instead of a warm bed, a quiet room, and a moment of peace, you are lying on a hard wooden surface inside a massive warship, surrounded by hundreds of exhausted sailors, with the entire vessel moving and creaking beneath you. The waves never stop, the wooden walls constantly groan, the air is filled with the smell of salt, sweat, and old timber, and somewhere in the darkness, you are trying to find just a few hours of sleep before another difficult day begins. This was the nightly reality for many ancient sailors. The ships that carried powerful armies across the Mediterranean were symbols of strength and victory. But for the people who lived on them, they were often uncomfortable, crowded, and exhausting places where even sleeping could become a challenge. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how many history lovers and people avoiding sleep for questionable reasons gather here. Now, close your eyes and imagine the world thousands of years ago. The year is long before modern ships, modern cabins, or comfortable travel. You are standing beside the ancient Mediterranean Sea, watching a powerful wooden warship resting near the shore. From a distance, it looks magnificent. Its tall structure cuts through the waves, its oars move with incredible speed, its warriors prepare for battles that will decide the fate of kingdoms. But behind this impressive image is a reality that few people think about, because when the sun disappears and the battles are over, the sailors still have to find somewhere to rest. There is no peaceful bedroom waiting below deck. There are no comfortable mattresses. There is no quiet place where you can escape from the world. Instead, hundreds of men are packed together inside a narrow wooden space. Some are trying to sleep, some are repairing equipment, some are preparing for what tomorrow may bring. Every movement of the ocean reaches the ship, every storm threatens their journey, every night brings the same question: how do you sleep when your entire world is a moving wooden battlefield? For ancient sailors, rest was not a luxury, it was something they had to fight for. A few precious hours of sleep before facing hard labor, dangerous seas, and the uncertainty of life aboard a warship. Tonight, we are stepping away from the famous battles and legendary commanders, and entering the hidden world of the ordinary sailors who made those victories possible. We will discover where they slept, how they survived the cramped conditions, what their nights were really like, and why life aboard an ancient warship was far less comfortable than the heroic stories often suggest. So make yourself comfortable, let the modern world slowly fade away, and allow yourself to drift back across the ancient seas, because tonight, we are discovering why sleeping on an ancient warship was a living nightmare. As darkness settles over the water, the shoreline slowly disappears into the evening mist. Small lanterns flicker across the deck, their soft glow dances across ropes, shields, and weathered wooden beams that have carried generations of sailors across uncertain waters. The day's labor is finally ending, the officers speak more quietly, the oars have become still, even the sea itself seems to breathe more slowly. Yet for the men aboard, the night offers no promises of comfort. One by one, weary sailors search for whatever space they can claim. Some lean against bundles of rope, others rest beside jars of water or stacks of equipment, a few simply lie where exhaustion defeats discomfort. Nobody complains. There is little point for many of these men. This floating world has become their home. They know every creak of the hull, every shifting shadow, every sound made by waves touching ancient wood. Above them, countless stars stretch across the Mediterranean sky. Without city lights to hide them, the heavens appear endless. Some sailors quietly whisper prayers, others stare upward in silence, thinking of distant families and homes they may not see for many months. Far away, Somewhere beyond the darkness, villages sleep peacefully on land, beds wait inside warm houses, dogs rest beside quiet fires, life moves gently. But here, upon the sea, life follows different rules, even during moments of calm. Uncertainty never truly leaves, because no sailor can predict what tomorrow's horizon may reveal. Clear skies, or black storms, friendly harbors, or enemy ships, safe journeys, or something far less welcoming, and as the vessel rocks softly beneath the moonlit sky, hundreds of tired men slowly close their eyes, not because conditions are pleasant, but because dawn always comes quickly upon the sea, and tomorrow, the ancient world will awaken once more, and with it, our journey into the lives of these forgotten sailors will truly begin. Morning arrives slowly upon the sea, not with the sound of alarm clocks or the distant hum of busy streets, but with the quiet cries of seabirds, the cool touch of dawn air, and the first pale light spreading across the endless waters. For the men aboard the warship, the night never truly felt long enough. Some wake stiff and sore, rubbing tired eyes as the wooden deck beneath them begins another day of gentle movement. Others have been awake for hours already, unable to find deep rest. In a world that never stops shifting, the stars that watched over them during the night have faded now, and in their place, the sun slowly rises above the Mediterranean, painting the water with soft shades of gold. As the crew stirs to life, you begin to understand something important. These men are not legendary heroes carved into marble statues. They are ordinary people, fishermen, farmers, laborers, young boys experiencing the sea for the first time, older veterans whose faces carry the marks of countless journeys. Some were born near the coast and grew up listening to waves against the shore. Others had never seen the open sea until duty placed an oar in their hands. And yet, despite their different lives, they now share the same floating home. Life aboard an ancient warship created strange bonds. Men from distant villages slept side by side, different accents filled the air. Different customs and beliefs traveled together beneath the same sails. There was little room for privacy, little opportunity for loneliness. The sea had a way of making everyone part of the same story. As the first tasks of the morning begin, sailors move carefully across the deck. Someone checks the ropes, another examines the sails, others clean equipment worn by salt and moisture. No movement is wasted, every small responsibility matters, because far from land, even simple mistakes could become dangerous. Many of these men spent months together, sometimes longer. They learned each other's habits, who snored loudly, who spoke in their sleep, who told the best stories after sunset, who quietly missed home but rarely admitted it. In the evenings, when work slowed, memories often returned. A wife waiting beside a small olive grove, children growing older with each passing season, parents whose faces became harder to remember. The sea connected kingdoms, but it also separated families, and perhaps that was one of its quietest burdens, for all the glory attached to ancient navies. Life at sea demanded sacrifices rarely mentioned by historians. Not every sailor carried a sword, not every man dreamed of victory. Many simply hoped for calm weather, safe harbors, and eventually, a journey back home. As the ship moves across the water, the crew settles into a rhythm practiced over generations. Commands are spoken, ropes tighten, wood creaks softly beneath countless footsteps, and above everything else, the sea remains constant, sometimes gentle, sometimes unforgiving, always present. To people living thousands of years ago, the sea was both friend and mystery. It brought trade, wealth, and opportunity, but beyond the familiar coastline stretched waters filled with uncertainty. Stories passed from sailor to sailor spoke of strange islands, hidden reefs, and distant lands wrapped in endless fog. Not every tale was true, but long nights and restless minds often gave life to unusual beliefs, and perhaps that made the world feel even larger, even more mysterious. As the sun climbs higher, the warship leaves the safety of the shore behind. The land slowly fades into the distance. Soon, there is only water in every direction, no roads, no villages, no comforting signs of home, only the endless horizon. And somewhere within this vast blue world, hundreds of ordinary men continue their daily lives, eating, working, laughing, worrying, dreaming, living between sky and sea, because before we can understand why sleeping aboard these ships was so difficult, we must first understand the people themselves, the men who called these wooden giants their homes. And as the journey continues, another truth slowly begins to reveal itself, for impressive as these warships appeared from afar, comfort was never part of their design, and that reality would shape every hour of life spent upon the ancient sea. As the shoreline disappears behind the morning haze, and the familiar world of villages and harbors slowly fades from view, another truth begins to emerge. From a distance, ancient warships seemed almost graceful, their long bodies sliced through the sea with remarkable speed, their painted eyes stared forward across the waves, their sails rose proudly against the sky. To those watching from the shore, they were symbols of power, but to the men who actually lived aboard them, they were something very different, because these vessels had never been created to provide comfort. They had been built for one purpose above all else, to move quickly. Speed meant survival. Speed meant victory, and every plank, every beam, every narrow passage inside the ship existed to serve that purpose. There was little room for luxury, very little room for privacy, and almost no thought given to peaceful sleep. The ship itself was surprisingly slender. Ancient warships needed to remain light enough for rowers and favorable winds to carry them efficiently across the Mediterranean. Heavy cabins and spacious living quarters would only slow them down, and so, comfort became a sacrifice, one willingly made by those who designed these floating weapons. To modern eyes, the arrangement might seem astonishing. There were no soft beds waiting below deck, no cozy sleeping chambers, no quiet corners hidden away from the world. Most sailors simply rested wherever space could be found, a section beside the mast, a narrow place between supplies, sometimes directly upon the wooden deck itself. The hard surface beneath them became strangely familiar over time, not pleasant, but familiar. Even the officers enjoyed only modest improvements, a slightly better position, a little more protection from wind and spray, but luxury remained rare. At sea, rank could change many things, yet it could not create space where none existed, and space was perhaps the most precious thing aboard an ancient warship. Every inch had a purpose. Bundles of rope occupied one area, storage jars filled another. Weapons needed their own places, tools had to remain accessible, supplies for long journeys consumed whatever room remained. The ship resembled a carefully organized puzzle. Nothing could be wasted, nothing unnecessary could remain, and so, the sailors themselves became part of that arrangement, living among the equipment, sleeping beside the necessities that kept everyone alive. There were practical reasons for this harsh design. Ancient naval commanders understood that warships spent much of their time moving between coastlines rather than remaining far out at sea. Crews often preferred to land whenever possible. Sleeping ashore offered warmth, safety, and fresh food, but nature rarely respected such plans. Unexpected weather, hostile shores, long missions, all could force the crew to remain aboard far longer than intended. And suddenly, the ship, transformed from a machine of war into a crowded home, one never truly meant for comfort. The wood itself added to the experience. Under the midday sun, it grew hot. During cool nights, it held little warmth. Moisture from sea spray soaked into every surface, salt slowly covered ropes and timbers alike. Nothing stayed dry for long, nothing remained truly clean, and yet, the sailors adapted. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to accept what becomes familiar. A young recruit arriving for the first time might stare in disbelief, an older veteran would simply shrug. This is how ships are, this is how life works. After enough seasons upon the water, discomfort no longer seemed unusual. It simply became another companion, like the wind, or the waves, or the endless horizon. But even among experienced crews, there remained one challenge that no design could solve, because no matter how carefully a ship was built, the sea itself refused to stay still, and when night returned, and exhausted men once again searched for sleep, they faced an enemy that could never be controlled, the constant motion beneath their feet, the endless rocking of the world around them, and for many ancient sailors, that movement would prove just as exhausting as the day itself. As evening slowly returns to the Mediterranean, and the sky begins its gentle transformation from blue to amber, the crew prepares for something that should have been simple: sleep, not glorious victories, not heroic speeches, not great discoveries, just a few quiet hours of rest. Yet aboard an ancient warship, even that small comfort could become surprisingly difficult, because while the sea offered endless horizons, space aboard the vessel itself remained painfully limited. And as shadows stretched across the deck, hundreds of tired men began the familiar ritual of searching for somewhere, anywhere, to close their eyes. There were no assigned cabins waiting below. No neat rows of bunks, no private rooms hidden behind wooden doors. The ship possessed no luxury of that kind. Instead, sailors adapted to whatever empty corner they could find. Some settled beside bundles of sailcloth, others curled themselves between storage jars filled with precious supplies. A fortunate few rested beneath awnings that offered some protection from dew and sea spray. Many simply stretched out directly upon the wooden deck. Hard planks became mattresses, coiled ropes became pillows, folded cloaks became blankets. Comfort was created not through abundance, but through imagination. Veteran sailors learned little tricks over the years. They understood which areas remained slightly warmer during cool nights. They knew where the wind struck least harshly, and they remembered which corners collected rainwater whenever storms appeared. Such knowledge was rarely written down. It passed quietly from older men to younger recruits, a kind word, a simple gesture. Years of experience shared beneath the stars. Sometimes friendships determined sleeping arrangements. Companions who had sailed together for many seasons naturally rested near one another. Stories were exchanged in hushed voices. Memories of home drifted through the darkness. Laughter occasionally rose above the gentle sounds of water. Not loud laughter, only the quiet kind that appears when exhaustion softens the mind, but space remained precious. Every sailor understood that stretching too far might inconvenience someone else. A misplaced arm, a careless foot, even during sleep, consideration became necessary. Life aboard the ship demanded cooperation, because privacy, that familiar comfort known on land, barely existed here. A man might awaken surrounded by dozens of faces, some snoring softly, others whispering prayers, one sailor talking in his dreams, another already awake, staring silently toward the stars above. There was no escaping the presence of others, no place to retreat, no door to close, and perhaps that constant closeness shaped the minds of ancient sailors more than we realize. Loneliness became rare, but solitude became almost impossible. Children growing up in quiet villages would have found such conditions strange, yet many sailors accepted them without complaint. Life itself had taught them to expect little comfort. Most homes in the ancient world were modest. Many families already shared limited spaces, and so, the crowded world of the warship felt less shocking than modern people might imagine. Still, acceptance did not make sleep easier. Because finding a place to lie down was only the beginning, the body itself faced other challenges. Hard surfaces created aching muscles, cold air crept through clothing during the night, sea spray left everything slightly damp, and no matter how carefully one positioned himself, the ship never stopped moving, slowly, constantly, almost as though the sea wished to remind everyone who truly ruled this world. Some sailors eventually learned to sleep despite the motion, others never. Completely adjusted, and newcomers often discovered that exhaustion alone could not guarantee rest, because lying down upon a warship and actually falling asleep were two very different things. As darkness deepens and lanterns flicker softly across the ancient vessel, the crew closes weary eyes, the stars shine above, the horizon disappears into blackness, and beneath them, the endless Mediterranean continues its quiet dance, a dance that would accompany every dream and disturb countless nights, for the sea itself never truly sleeps, and neither, it seemed, did the ships that crossed it. Night settles once again across the ancient sea, and as the last traces of daylight disappear beyond the horizon, a strange kind of quiet begins to spread over the warship. The conversations grow softer, the lantern flames flicker gently, even the gulls that followed the vessel throughout the day have vanished into the darkness. At first, everything feels peaceful, almost comforting, but for the weary sailors preparing for another night of rest, a familiar challenge quietly returns, because while the stars above appear calm and unmoving, the world beneath them never stays still. The ship rocks, slowly, endlessly, a gentle rise, a subtle fall, again, and again, and again. To someone standing safely upon solid ground, such motion might seem insignificant, but after hours, and then days, and then weeks, that constant movement became impossible to ignore. Even lying down required adjustment. A sailor could settle himself carefully upon the deck, he close his eyes, and still feel the world shifting beneath his body. The wooden planks creaked softly, loose ropes swayed, water whispered against the hull. Nothing remained perfectly steady. For new recruits, these first nights could feel deeply unsettling. Their minds expected stillness, their bodies longed for familiar beds and unmoving floors. Instead, every muscle remained quietly alert. Even in sleep, balance had to be maintained. Some awoke suddenly, confused by the sensation of drifting, others found themselves rolling slightly against nearby companions. And a few simply stared into the darkness, waiting for exhaustion to overcome discomfort. Veterans understood these struggles well. Many smiled kindly at the frustrations of younger sailors, because they remembered experiencing the same thing years before. With time, the human body adapted, or perhaps it simply surrendered. Some older sailors claimed they could sense changes in the sea even while asleep, a slight difference in the rocking, a change in the wind, a new rhythm in the movement beneath the ship. Whether such stories were entirely true remained uncertain, but life at sea sharpened senses in unusual ways. There were nights when the Mediterranean seemed gentle and kind. The ship floated almost peacefully, dreams came more easily, breathing slowed, and for a few precious hours, rest became possible. Those nights were treasured, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were rare. More often, the sea possessed its own restless personality. Small waves lifted the vessel unexpectedly, currents shifted without warning, the hull groaned softly as though the ship itself had grown tired. And every movement traveled through the wooden structure. Nothing escaped it, not the officers, not the rowers, not even the most experienced sailor aboard. Some men learned curious sleeping positions, a bent arm against a support beam, a folded cloak beneath the head. one leg resting against a bundle of supplies to prevent rolling too far. Simple solutions born from years of necessity. No manuals taught these tricks, no commander issued instructions. Experience itself became the teacher, and over countless journeys, strange habits became ordinary. Still, true comfort remained elusive. Because even when the sea behaved kindly, the mind rarely relaxed completely. A sailor never forgot where he was. Beneath him lay deep waters, around him stretched endless darkness, and somewhere beyond the horizon, unknown things awaited the coming dawn. Perhaps a peaceful harbor, perhaps dangerous weather, perhaps news from home, or perhaps another long day that looked exactly like the one before. Such thoughts drifted quietly through tired minds as the stars wheeled overhead. And somewhere among the sleeping crew, a man turned slowly upon the hard deck, searching for a better position, searching for a little peace, searching for sleep itself. Yet another challenge still remained, because movement alone was not the only enemy of rest, for throughout the long hours of darkness, the warship possessed a voice of its own, a chorus of sounds that never truly disappeared, and before morning arrived, those sounds would become impossible to ignore. As the vessel continues its slow journey through the darkness, and the tired crew settles into uneasy rest, another truth begins to reveal itself. The sea, despite its beauty, was never truly silent. From afar, a ship crossing the Mediterranean beneath the stars might appear peaceful, almost dreamlike, a lonely shape gliding across quiet waters. But step aboard, close your eyes, and listen carefully. Because night upon an ancient warship possessed 1,000 voices, and very few of them allowed a man to sleep deeply. The first sound came from the ship itself. Wood was alive in its own strange way. Every plank shifted, every beam complained, the hull groaned softly beneath the pressure of waves. Ropes tightened and loosened with gentle creaks as masts whispered against the wind. To newcomers, these sounds could be unnerving. In the darkness, unfamiliar noises often felt larger than they truly were. A sudden crack from the timbers might send a young sailor sitting upright in alarm. An older veteran, meanwhile, barely opened his eyes. He knew the language of the ship, and he understood that ancient wood had many ways of speaking. Then there were the sounds of water, always present, always moving. Waves brushed against the hull with endless patience. Sometimes they lapped softly, almost like a lullaby. Other nights, they slapped the ship with surprising force. Tiny streams of spray found their way through narrow gaps. Drops of seawater tapped rhythmically against the deck. No two nights sounded exactly alike. The sea constantly changed its voice, and the sailors listened without even realizing it. Yet perhaps the loudest sounds came from the men themselves. Hundreds of exhausted souls packed closely together created their own strange orchestra. Someone snored loudly, another muttered in his dreams. A restless sleeper shifted against the wooden planks. Quiet coughs drifted through the darkness. Soft prayers escaped tired lips. A few men spoke in whispers before sleep finally claimed them. And somewhere nearby, someone always seemed to be awake, because aboard a warship, complete rest for everyone was impossible. Certain duties continued throughout the night. Watchmen remained alert beneath the stars. Experienced sailors checked ropes and sails. Officers occasionally moved across the deck with careful footsteps. The ship itself never slept, and neither could all of its crew. Lanterns flickered gently in the darkness. Sandaled feet tapped softly upon the wood. Metal tools occasionally touched with a faint clink. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic, only countless little sounds woven together into the fabric of life at sea. Then came the wind. Invisible, unpredictable, sometimes. It sang softly through the rigging. Other times it whistled with eerie voices that seemed almost human. Ancient sailors often filled such sounds with stories. Long nights and endless waters encouraged strange thoughts. Perhaps spirits traveled with the breeze, perhaps distant gods whispered beyond the darkness, or perhaps exhausted minds simply searched for meaning in ordinary things. Whatever the explanation, the wind had a talent for making lonely nights feel even more mysterious. And then there were the unexpected noises, a dropped tool, a shifting amphora, the sudden cry of a seabird passing overhead. Even the splash of a fish breaking the surface could startle sleeping men awake. True silence became something remembered rather than experienced, something belonging to quiet homes on land, not to floating worlds of timber and salt. Yet strangely enough, many sailors eventually missed these sounds whenever they returned home. After months at sea, stillness itself felt unusual, too quiet, too empty. The absence of creaking wood became unsettling. The silence of solid ground seemed almost unnatural, because human beings possess remarkable habits, and over time, even discomfort can become familiar. But there was one thing aboard ancient warships that no sailor could completely ignore. Something far more difficult to escape than sounds, something that clung to clothes, to wood, and even to memory itself. For with the coming dawn, another challenge quietly awaited, one carried not by wind, but by the air itself. By the time the first pale light of dawn begins to touch the horizon, the sounds of the night slowly fade into the background. The watchmen exchange quiet words, lanterns burn lower, and somewhere among the sleeping crew, tired eyes reluctantly begin to open once again. Another day upon the sea has arrived. But while the creaking wood and endless motion eventually became familiar companions, there was one part of life aboard an ancient warship that no amount of experience could completely erase, something impossible to avoid, something impossible to silence, and unlike the stars above or the waves below, it surrounded the sailors every moment of every day, the air itself. Because an ancient warship possessed a scent all its own, a scent that no painter could capture, and one that historians rarely describe. At first, there was the smell of the sea, fresh salt carried by the wind, moist air rising from the endless waters. It might sound pleasant to modern ears, and sometimes, when the breeze was strong and the sky clear, it truly was. But the sea brought far more than freshness, it brought dampness, constant dampness. Wood absorbed it. Clothing absorbed it. Blankets, ropes, and sails held onto moisture day after day. Nothing ever felt completely dry, and damp wood possessed its own ancient smell, rich, earthy, heavy, a scent created by years of salt, rain, and countless journeys beneath the Mediterranean sun. Mixed with this came the smell of tar. Shipbuilders used it to protect the hull and preserve the wood. It helped keep the vessel alive against the endless attacks of water and time, but its strong aroma lingered everywhere. Warm afternoons made it even more noticeable. The scent rose from the timbers themselves, surrounding the crew like an invisible companion. Then came the smell of sweat. Hundreds of men living together in close quarters, working beneath the sun, pulling ropes, carrying supplies, and rowing for hours, created an atmosphere no amount of sea breeze could completely erase. Bathing opportunities were limited, fresh water was too valuable to waste, and so, sailors learned to live with what nature provided. Their clothes carried the memory of hard labor, their hands smelled of salt and rope, their skin bore the scent of long days beneath the sun. No one expected otherwise. Because everyone shared the same conditions, strangely enough, familiarity softened discomfort. What shocked newcomers eventually became ordinary. Veterans barely noticed it anymore, or perhaps they simply stopped speaking about it. Food added its own layer to the air. Dried fish, olive oil, garlic, onions, grain stored in sacks, barrels and amphorae filled with precious supplies. Their scents mingled together in curious ways. Sometimes pleasant, sometimes less so, and occasionally, something spoiled. the ancient world lacked modern preservation. Heat and moisture could quickly turn valuable food into something far less welcome. When that happened, sailors acted quickly. Because waste was dangerous, and unpleasant smells often signaled greater problems hidden beneath the surface, animals occasionally traveled with the crew as well. Small creatures found aboard ships added their own presence to daily life. Though few sailors considered such things unusual, they simply accepted them. Acceptance, after all, was one of the greatest skills life at sea demanded, and yet, there were rare moments, beautiful moments, when a fresh morning breeze swept across the deck, the scent of the sea became clean once more, the smell of distant land drifted over the water, wild herbs from unseen shores, olive trees growing beyond the horizon, the faint fragrance of earth itself, and in those moments, many sailors smiled, because even before land appeared, their senses knew. Home was near, but long before such comforts arrived, another challenge awaited them, one far more difficult than unpleasant odors, because sharing smells with hundreds of men was one thing, sharing every hour of life with them, day and night, was something else entirely, and as the sun rises higher above the ancient Mediterranean, the crowded world of the warship begins to awaken once again. As the fresh scent of morning slowly fades, and the day settles into its familiar rhythm, another reality of life at sea quietly reveals itself. For ancient sailors, discomfort was not experienced alone. Every hardship, every restless night, every aching muscle, was shared, because aboard these great wooden vessels, solitude was almost impossible to find, from sunrise to sunset, and often long after darkness returned. Hundreds of men lived together within a world no larger than a floating strip of timber upon the sea, and over time, that closeness shaped their lives in ways few people now imagine. There were always faces nearby, always voices, always movement. Someone sharpening tools, someone repairing worn ropes, someone quietly eating, someone gazing toward the horizon in silent thought. Even moments of peace belonged not to individuals, but to the entire crew. Privacy, as we understand it today, scarcely existed. A sailor could not simply disappear for an hour. There were no empty rooms, no quiet corners untouched by others. Life unfolded in full view, habits became familiar. Personalities became impossible to hide, and so, men learned to accept one another's peculiarities, the loud snorer, the endless storyteller, the young recruit who missed home and tried not to show it, the older veteran who preferred silence. The sailor who constantly worried, the one who laughed too loudly. After enough months together, these small details became part of daily life. In some strange way, they became comforting, for companionship, even imperfect companionship, eased the loneliness of the sea. Friendships formed naturally, not through grand moments, but through ordinary ones, sharing a meal, exchanging stories beneath the stars, helping repair damaged equipment, passing time during long stretches of calm weather. Men who had once been strangers slowly became familiar faces, and familiar faces brought reassurance, especially when storms appeared or distant waters felt unfamiliar. Yet closeness also created tension. Exhaustion made tempers shorter, crowded spaces encouraged disagreements. Simple misunderstandings sometimes grew larger than they deserved. There were arguments, harsh words, moments of frustration. After all, human nature had changed very little across the centuries, but experienced crews understood something important. Resentment was a dangerous burden at sea. Because survival often depended upon trust, tomorrow's storm might require every hand, tomorrow's emergency might place lives in one another's care, and so, grudges were usually short-lived. Practicality often overcame pride. Many sailors came from different regions, different cities, different customs, Some worshipped certain gods more faithfully than others, some carried traditions unfamiliar to their companions, yet aboard the ship, such differences often mattered less than necessity. The sea cared little for accents or hometowns, waves treated everyone equally, and shared hardship possessed a curious power. It blurred distinctions, creating bonds stronger than strangers might expect. At night, as the stars emerged overhead, conversation sometimes drifted toward memories, simple memories, the smell of bread baking at home, children chasing goats through dusty villages, olive groves swaying beneath summer winds, festivals, markets, families, places untouched by salt and endless water. These stories became treasures. Little reminders that another world still existed beyond the horizon, a quieter world, a more familiar world, and perhaps that was why sailors listened so carefully, because every story carried a piece of home. But no matter how close companions became, life aboard the warship remained demanding. Friendship could ease discomfort, laughter could soften difficult days, yet neither could solve the practical problems that accompanied life upon the sea. Because hundreds of mouths required food, hundreds of bodies required water, and every sunrise brought the same quiet question: how could so many people survive together in such a small and unforgiving world? As afternoon light dances across the Mediterranean, and shadows stretch along the deck once more, the answer begins to reveal itself, and like so many things aboard ancient warships, it was never simple. As the sun climbs higher above the Mediterranean, and the gentle rhythm of the ship continues without pause, life aboard the warship shifts from quiet reflection into constant necessity, because beyond the stories, beyond the friendships, beyond the long nights under the stars, there was something far more immediate that shaped every single day: survival, not in the dramatic sense of battle or storm, but in the quiet, repetitive struggle of staying fed, staying hydrated, and simply continuing forward in a world surrounded by endless water that could not be safely drunk. At first glance, it might seem strange, a ship surrounded by the largest sea known to these ancient sailors. Yet thirst was one of their greatest concerns. The Mediterranean offered no comfort in that regard. Its salt water could not quench the human body, and so, every drop of fresh water became precious, stored carefully in large clay amphorae, guarded with quiet discipline, measured with caution that grew stricter as the journey continued. Even simple drinking required awareness. Too much waste early in the voyage could lead to serious hardship later. And every sailor understood this without needing to be told. Food carried its own challenges. Before modern preservation, nothing lasted easily under sun and salt air. Dried grains formed the foundation of meals: barley, wheat, simple and reliable; olive oil added energy and flavor. Sometimes dried fish or preserved meat appeared, carefully stored for longer journeys, but freshness was rare, and variety even rarer. Meals were not celebrations, they were maintenance, moments designed to keep the body moving rather than to bring joy. Cooking aboard a moving warship was never simple. Small fires had to be managed carefully. Wind could shift suddenly, spray from the sea could dampen supplies, and space was always limited. Most preparation happened in quiet, improvised corners of the vessel, wherever heat could be controlled safely, and where smoke would not interfere with sails or navigation. Every meal carried the taste of effort, of salt, of storage, of time, yet sailors rarely complained, because expectation shaped experience. No one joined an ancient naval crew expecting comfort, only endurance. Still, the human body has its own quiet demands. Hunger cannot be ignored, thirst becomes impossible to forget, and fatigue grows heavier when nutrition is poor, after long days of rowing, repairing, or standing watch. Even simple food became deeply valuable. A piece of bread could feel like relief, a sip of water like recovery, and these small moments kept the crew alive in ways that history often overlooks. Supplies, however, were never infinite. Every voyage required careful planning. Ships needed to know where they could resupply, which coastal towns might offer aid, which harbors were safe to enter, and which waters were best avoided altogether. When plans failed, when storms delayed arrival, or when routes became uncertain, the entire ship felt the pressure. Rations became smaller, routines became stricter, and conversations grew quieter. Even the strongest sailors could feel the weight of scarcity, not in panic, but in careful awareness, a shared understanding that everything aboard depended on balance. Water consumed too quickly meant future thirst, food used without thought meant future hunger, and so discipline became part of daily life, not enforced loudly, but lived quietly by everyone on board. Yet amid these constant concerns, there were still moments of relief. A calm morning when supplies were checked and found sufficient, a shared meal eaten without worry of shortage, a gentle breeze that made stored water feel slightly cooler, small comforts, but meaningful ones. And sometimes, as the ship moved steadily across open water, a distant coastline would appear on the horizon. A reminder that land still existed, that wells and markets and orchards were not just memories, but places waiting ahead. And in those moments, hope returned quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to ease the burden of another long day at sea. Because even in a world defined by salt, wood, and endless waves, life always found a way to continue, carefully, quietly, one measured sip at a time. The sea has a way of changing its mood without warning. One moment it is calm, almost gentle beneath a pale sky, and the next, it carries a tension that even the most experienced sailors can feel in silence. On an ancient warship, that feeling often arrived before anything else, before the drums, before the commands, before the first sight of enemy sails on the horizon. It arrived at night, when the ship was still moving steadily through darkness, and most of the crew were trying, as always, to find whatever rest they could. But sleep, on nights like these, was never truly peaceful, because somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of lantern light, beyond the edge of vision, something awaited, a possible encounter, a possible battle, or sometimes nothing at all. That uncertainty was what made everything heavier. Even the air felt different, quieter in a way that was not comforting, more like the world itself was holding its breath. Sailors preparing for such nights did not speak loudly. Even ordinary conversation softened into whispers. Movements became slower, more deliberate, as if noise itself might disturb fate. Below the deck, men lay down, as they always did, on wooden planks, beside ropes, between supplies that had become familiar companions. But rest came differently now. Eyes closed more slowly, thoughts lingered longer before fading. Every sound from the water outside carried meaning, a distant splash, a shifting current, the faint creak of wood as the ship adjusted its course. Each one pulled the mind back toward alertness. Experienced sailors knew this feeling well. They had learned that the night before danger was rarely calm inside the mind. Even when the sea appeared peaceful, sleep became lighter, shorter, more fragile. Some men tried to rest anyway, trusting exhaustion to carry them through. Others remained half awake, listening to the rhythm of the vessel. A few sat quietly, staring into the darkness, as if watching the future itself. No one needed to explain what might come. The ship carried that knowledge without words, because ancient warfare at sea was not announced in advance. It arrived suddenly, often without warning, and always at a time when rest was most needed. Yet even in this uneasy atmosphere, humanity continued its quiet struggle to sleep. for the body does not easily abandon its needs, fatigue still presses down, eyelids still grow heavy, and eventually, even fear must share space with exhaustion. Some sailors drifted into shallow sleep, dreams fragmented and uncertain. Others woke often, unable to remain in one state for long. Between sleep and wakefulness, time became difficult to measure. Only the slow movement of the ship reminded them that the night still continued. Above them, the stars remained unchanged, unaware of human tension, unmoved by distant concerns, and yet, those same stars had guided countless journeys, including those that led ships toward conflict. As the night deepens, tension does not always grow louder. Sometimes it simply settles, becoming part of the atmosphere, a quiet weight shared by everyone aboard. Even the wind seems careful, even the waves appear restrained, and still, no one knows what the horizon will bring with morning light, friend or enemy, peace or violence, return or uncertainty. And so, sailors sleep not because they feel safe, but because there is no other choice, because dawn will come regardless of rest. And whatever awaits beyond the darkness will demand every remaining strength they have. Slowly, the ship continues forward, cutting through unseen waters, carrying men between sleep and fear, between exhaustion and duty, between what is known and what is still waiting ahead. As the night fades and the first light of dawn touches the sea, the warship begins to feel different, not quieter, not calmer, but more alive in a harsher way, because beneath the sleeping crew, beneath the wooden deck, and beneath the surface of the ship's elegant shape, another world exists, a hidden world, one that rarely appears in heroic stories or polished history books, the world of the rowers. For many ancient warships, especially in moments of urgency or battle, speed did not come from wind alone. It came from human strength, from hundreds of men seated in tight, unforgiving rows, moving oars in perfect rhythm for hours at a time, and their life was nothing like the romantic image of sea travel. Below deck, the air changed completely. It became heavier, thicker, warmer. The space was narrow, designed with efficiency in mind rather than comfort. Wooden benches stretched along the interior like endless lines of necessity. Rowers sat close together, shoulder to shoulder, with barely enough room to shift their bodies. There was no luxury of open space, no chance to stretch freely, only the steady requirement of coordination. When the command was given, everything became movement, up, forward, pull, again and again. The rhythm of the oars shaped the rhythm of their bodies, their lives, even their sleep, because exhaustion followed them everywhere. Rowing was not a short task. It could continue for hours under the sun, or into long stretches of night when silence above the deck felt almost distant. Sweat gathered quickly in the confined space below. Air did not circulate easily. The smell of wood, salt, and human effort remained constant. Yet even in these harsh conditions, discipline held everything together. A single mistake could disrupt the entire rhythm of the ship, and in ancient naval warfare, rhythm meant survival. Rowers came from many backgrounds. Some were free men seeking wages, others were laborers bound by circumstance. And in certain fleets, slaves were forced into service, their lives tied to the strength of their arms and the will of their overseers. But regardless of origin, all shared the same reality. Once seated at the oar, identity mattered less than endurance. And endurance mattered more than comfort. When the ship was at sea, rowers often worked in shifts. One group would exert themselves while another attempted brief rest, but even rest was limited. The narrow benches and constant movement of the vessel made deep sleep almost impossible. Some would close their eyes while still seated, their bodies swaying gently with the motion of the ship. Others leaned forward, resting their heads on arms or oars, always ready to return to work at the Sound of a command. Above them, life on deck continued in a different world. Sailors moved freely, the wind felt lighter, the sky was visible, but below deck, the world was reduced to wood. Breath and repetition. Over time, rowers developed an almost instinctive coordination. They did not need to see each other clearly, they felt the rhythm. The shared motion became a language of its own, a language written in effort rather than words. There were moments when the work became almost hypnotic, the repetition. The synchronized movement, the steady pulse of oars meeting water. In rare instances, this rhythm allowed the mind to drift briefly, even in exhaustion, but such moments never lasted long, because command could change instantly, speed could increase without warning, and every man had to respond immediately. Fatigue was constant, pain was familiar, and rest was never guaranteed. Yet without these men, the ship would lose one of its greatest strengths. Because in calm winds, or urgent chases, or battles where timing mattered more than anything, rowers transformed the warship into something faster than wind alone could achieve. They were unseen, often unspoken of in grand tales, but essential to every journey across the ancient sea. And as the ship continues forward into the widening daylight, their silent labor continues beneath the surface, carrying not only the vessel, but the weight of everything it represents. As the Mediterranean light grows brighter, and the sea opens into wide, shimmering space, the story of ancient warships begins to take a more defined shape, because among all naval traditions of the ancient world, few were as influential, or as demanding, as those of the Greeks. Their warships were fast, narrow, and built with precision, designed for agility rather than comfort, for speed rather than stability, and for battle rather than rest. From the outside, a Greek trireme could appear almost elegant as it moved across the water, its long wooden frame cut through waves with surprising grace, its oars worked in perfect coordination, driven by human strength below the surface. But beneath that graceful movement, life was anything but graceful. Inside these ships, space was reduced to its absolute minimum. Every section had a purpose, every corner served function over comfort, and the men who lived aboard them adapted to conditions that modern minds can barely imagine. The rowers sat in tightly arranged tiers, each level carefully structured to maximize power. Above them, sailors handled navigation, sails, and command, but nowhere on the vessel was there anything resembling personal space. Sleep, like everything else, was shaped by necessity. On long voyages, Greek crews often had to remain ready for sudden action. Their ships were not designed for leisurely travel. They were instruments of war, often used in coastal waters where encounters could happen without warning, and so, even rest was shaped by readiness. Men would lie down wherever space allowed, between ropes, along narrow beams, or directly upon wooden surfaces still warm from the day's movement. The sound of the sea was never far away, it entered through gaps in the hull. It echoed beneath the decks, it blended with the constant creaking of wood under pressure. Even in calm conditions, the ship never truly felt still. The Greeks understood this reality well. Their naval strength depended not only on design and skill, but also on endurance. A crew that could not function after long nights at sea would struggle in battle, and so, discipline extended into every hour of life aboard the ship. Food was simple. Bread, olives, dried fish, occasionally supplemented when land was near, or water was carefully measured. Every resource was tracked with quiet attention. Nothing was wasted, because at sea, waste quickly became danger. Yet despite these hardships, Greek sailors developed remarkable coordination. They learned to move as one organism, to respond instantly to commands shouted across wind and water, to trust that every oar, every hand, every decision would align at the right moment. This unity extended beyond battle. it shaped daily life. Even sleep became a shared rhythm, men resting in clusters, adjusting to the movement of the ship together, waking at similar hours when duty called, but exhaustion was a constant companion. Long hours of rowing beneath the sun, sudden shifts in weather, unexpected changes in direction or mission, all of it left little room for recovery, and still, the sea demanded more. Greek warships often operated close to coastlines. This meant that nights could bring uncertainty, harbors were not always safe, shorelines were not always welcoming, and the possibility of sudden conflict remained present even in darkness. Because of this, sailors rarely felt fully detached from their duties. Even in rest, awareness remained close, a part of the mind always listening, always waiting. Yet there were moments when the sea softened, when wind slowed, when the horizon turned gentle shades of blue and gold, and in those rare intervals, the harshness of life seemed briefly distant. Men would lie quietly, listening not for danger, but for the simple rhythm of water against wood, a sound so constant it became almost like breath. But these moments never lasted long, because the sea, like history itself, never stayed the same for long, and as the Greek ships continue their journey across shifting waters, their legacy quietly shapes everything that follows, not only in warfare, but in the very experience of living and sleeping upon the ancient sea. As the Mediterranean world continues to shift through time, the Greek way of the sea slowly gives way to another rising power, the Romans, and with them comes a new approach to warships, stronger in structure, heavier in presence, and built with an expanding empire in mind. Roman warships did not drift quietly across the sea like distant thoughts. They moved with purpose, with authority, with the weight of a civilization that believed the ocean itself could be controlled. Yet for all their strength and discipline, life aboard these vessels remained far from comfortable. In fact, in many ways, it became even more demanding. Roman ships were designed to support larger crews. More soldiers, more rowers, more equipment. This made them powerful in battle, but also increasingly crowded during long voyages. Every section of the ship felt occupied, every space had a function, and every function demanded human effort. Below deck, rowers continued their exhausting rhythm. Above them, soldiers prepared for combat or stood watch over the horizon, and between these layers of purpose, there was almost no room left for rest. Sleep, once again, became something improvised rather than planned, a brief pause taken wherever the body could manage it, a corner near the mast, a space beside stacked shields, or a narrow strip of deck warmed by the sun earlier in the day. Roman discipline shaped every aspect of life at sea. Orders were clear, routines were strict, and efficiency mattered above all else. Even exhaustion was expected to follow structure. But the human body does not always obey commands. Fatigue still arrived without permission, and sleep still found its way into the smallest gaps of time. Food and water continued to define daily survival. Roman supply systems were more organized than earlier naval traditions, but they were still limited by distance and weather. Ships carried grain, hard bread, olives, salted meats, and wine diluted for daily consumption, everything carefully rationed, everything accounted for, nothing wasted, because at sea, waste was more than carelessness. It was risk, the smell aboard. Roman warships carried a familiar mixture, wood soaked in salt, sweat from crowded decks, tar used for maintenance, and the constant presence of stored food and supplies. Over time, these scents blended into something that belonged only to the sea. Something sailors recognized as home, even if they never called it that. Roman sailors and soldiers came from across a vast empire, different languages, different customs, different lives before the sea brought them together. But aboard the ship, those differences gradually faded. What remained was function. Who could row? Who could fight? who could endure, and who could continue when others were too exhausted to move. There was little room for individuality in such an environment. Identity became tied to role, role became tied to survival, and survival depended on cooperation. Yet even within this structure, small human moments still existed: a shared glance during a difficult shift, a quiet exchange of food, a brief conversation about home during a calm evening. These fragments of humanity helped soften the harshness of life at sea, but they could not remove it, because the Roman sea was still unpredictable. Storms arrived without warning, currents shifted, and distant enemies could appear when least expected. Even at rest, sailors remained aware of the world around them. Sleep was never entirely deep, never completely free of tension, and yet, despite everything, the Roman war machine continued to move across the Mediterranean, linking distant shores, transporting armies, securing trade routes, and reshaping the ancient world, all powered by men who rarely appeared in the stories of conquest, men who slept where they could, ate what was given, and endured conditions that history often passes over too quickly. As the ship continues forward under a fading sky, the boundaries between discipline and exhaustion begin to blur, and in that blurred space, life aboard a Roman warship quietly continues, steady, relentless, and always moving toward the next horizon. The sea never truly stays the same for long, even when it appears calm, almost like a painted surface beneath a quiet sky. There is always the possibility of change waiting just beyond the horizon, and for sailors aboard ancient warships, that possibility was never forgotten, because nothing transformed life at sea more suddenly than a storm. It rarely began with drama, no warning bell, no clear announcement. Instead, it arrived slowly at first. A shift in the wind, a subtle heaviness in the air, clouds gathering far away, almost unnoticed at first glance, and then, without warning, the world would begin to move differently. The gentle rocking of the ship became sharper, less predictable. The water beneath turned restless, rising and falling with increasing force, and the night, which had once felt quiet, became something entirely different. Inside the warship, everything changed. Sleep disappeared first, not gently, but completely. Men who had just closed their eyes were suddenly awake again, gripping wooden beams or ropes as the vessel shifted beneath them. The ship creaked louder than before, wood groaned under pressure. Every part of the structure seemed to respond to the growing force of the sea. Lanterns swung with uneven motion, casting unstable shadows across the deck. Light and darkness moved together in strange rhythm. Below deck, conditions became even more intense. Rowers, if present, had to maintain control even as the ship rose and fell unpredictably. Every movement required effort, every command demanded immediate response. There was no space for hesitation, and yet, the storm did not care. Waves struck the hull with increasing strength. Water sprayed across the deck, soaking everything in its path. Ropes tightened violently, sails strained against wind that no longer behaved gently. What had been a vessel of order and routine became something closer to survival. Sailors moved quickly, securing equipment, adjusting sails, and trying to maintain balance on a deck that no longer felt stable. Communication became louder, shorter, more urgent, but even in chaos, experience mattered. Veteran sailors knew how to read the storm's rhythm. They understood when to act and when to wait, when to tighten, when to release, when to trust the ship's design to endure what the sea was delivering. Younger sailors often struggled more. Every wave felt larger, every movement felt more dangerous, but they followed instructions, learning through action rather than explanation, because in storms like these, there was no time for anything else. And yet, strangely, even within this chaos, there were brief moments of structure, moments where coordinated effort brought order back. Even if only temporarily, a sail adjusted at the right moment could stabilize the vessel, a correctly timed turn could reduce strain, a unified response could prevent disaster, but nothing could stop the storm itself. It simply passed when it was ready, not when humans wished it would. Inside the ship, exhaustion and fear blended together. There was no true sleep, only brief pauses between actions, moments where the body leaned against wood for a few seconds before moving again. And all the while, the sea continued its endless motion, uninterested in human struggle, unmoved by effort or experience, just present. Powerful and constant, eventually, as with all storms, the intensity begins to fade, not suddenly, but gradually. The wind softens, the waves lose their sharpness, the ship, though still moving, feels less like it is being thrown and more like it is being carried once again. Sailors slow their movements, breathing becomes steadier, and silence returns in fragments, not complete silence, but the quieter kind that feels almost unfamiliar after chaos, wetwood, dripping ropes, heavy breathing, and tired eyes looking out toward a sky slowly clearing again. But even after storms pass, their memory remains, in the minds of sailors, in the damaged sails, in the strained ropes, and in the bodies that carry exhaustion deeper than sleep alone can fix, because on the ancient sea, a storm was never just weather. It was an experience that stayed long after the waves calmed, and as night begins to settle once more, the question quietly returns, not whether the sea will remain calm, but when it will change again. After the storm has passed, and the sea once again settles into its slower rhythm, a different kind of discomfort begins to reveal itself aboard the ancient warship, not sudden like a wave, not loud like a storm, but small, persistent, and impossible to fully escape, because life at sea was not only shaped by wind, water, and wood, but also by the smallest living things that traveled with the ship itself. In the confined world of an ancient warship, nothing truly remained. Separate, men, supplies, animals, and even the hidden creatures of the sea and land all shared the same floating space. At first, most of these problems were barely noticed. A few insects brought aboard from shore, tiny movements in stored grain, small signs of life within the shadows of wooden beams. But over time, these details became part of daily reality, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just constant. The ship, always warm from sun and crowded bodies, created an environment where small creatures could thrive unnoticed. Ropes, sails, and wooden cracks offered countless hiding places, and once something found its way aboard, it often stayed. Sailors learned to live with this presence, not because it was pleasant, but because it was unavoidable. The tension focused instead on more immediate concerns: survival, navigation, sleep. Yet even in moments of rest, the mind remained lightly aware of movement nearby. A shifting sound in storage, a faint rustle in the dark. Nothing loud enough to cause alarm, but enough to remind a sailor that he was never entirely alone in this wooden world. There were also larger challenges. Animals sometimes traveled with the crew, small livestock carried for food, or birds that landed during long journeys and refused to leave. Even these harmless companions added to the complexity of life aboard the ship. Space became even more limited, noise increased slightly, and daily routines adjusted to accommodate every living presence on board. The sea itself contributed its own creatures. Fish occasionally struck the hull at night. Strange shapes moved beneath the surface, seen only in brief glimpses when light touched the water. Most sailors paid little attention, but in darkness, imagination often filled gaps where vision could not reach. Not all problems were visible. Some came from the environment itself, Moisture weakened stored supplies, heat changed the condition of food, salt air slowly affected everything it touched. Even weapons required constant care, metal rusted, wood softened, rope frayed, nothing remained untouched for long, and so maintenance became a constant responsibility, a quiet, ongoing effort that never truly ended. Sailors cleaned when they could, repaired when time allowed, and adapted when nothing else was possible. In such conditions, patience became as important as skill. But despite all these challenges, life aboard the ship continued in its usual rhythm. Men still slept when exhaustion overcame discomfort, still worked when commands were given, still ate what was available, still moved through each day with practiced endurance. What is striking is not the presence of problems, but the ability of people to continue despite them, because over time, even discomfort becomes familiar. Even difficulty becomes routine, and what once felt overwhelming slowly becomes simply part of life. There were moments of frustration, of course, times when sailors muttered about spoiled food, or restless nights disturbed by unseen movement, or equipment that required constant repair, but these moments rarely lasted. The sea demanded attention elsewhere, and energy was always needed for more important tasks. Still, every sailor understood a simple truth: the ship was not a perfect place, it was not meant to be. It was a living environment shaped by necessity rather than comfort, a space where nature, human effort, and constant movement all collided, and somehow it continued to function, day after day, night after night, across calm waters and stormy seas alike. As the sun begins to set once again over the Mediterranean, the ship drifts forward through a world that never stops changing, and within it, life continues in all its imperfect, persistent detail, small, unseen, but always present. As night slowly returns over the ancient Mediterranean, and the sky shifts into deep shades of blue and fading gold, the warship begins to quiet once again. Lanterns are lit one by one, soft light spreads across the wooden deck, and the crew prepares, as always, for another attempt at rest. But by now, every sailor understands a simple truth: sleep aboard an ancient warship is never simply about closing your eyes, it is about protection. Protection from movement, from cold, from discomfort, and from everything the sea can change without warning. So before sleep truly begins, small preparations take place, not organized as formal rituals, but learned through experience. A kind of practical wisdom passed quietly through generations of sailors. Some men choose to sleep near sturdy structures, a thick mast, a reinforced beam, or tightly packed supplies that remain stable even when the ship moves. These become anchors for the body, points of stability in a world that never stops shifting. Others arrange ropes around themselves in simple ways, not to restrict movement, but to prevent rolling or sliding during the night. A practical solution shaped by necessity rather than design. Clothing also plays its role. Cloaks are wrapped more tightly, edges are pulled close against the body to hold warmth through cool sea air. Anything that can reduce exposure to wind or spray is used without hesitation. Even simple positioning becomes important. Sailors learn to align themselves with the ship's movement rather than against it, to reduce strain on muscles during the night, to avoid waking too often when the vessel shifts. Over time, these small adjustments become instinctive. New sailors often struggle at first. They lie down as if on solid ground, only to wake repeatedly as the ship moves beneath them. But veterans understand better. They adapt their bodies to the rhythm of the sea itself. Still, no preparation can remove every challenge. Cold remains a constant companion. Even in warmer climates, nighttime winds carry moisture across the deck, wood absorbs it, clothing absorbs it, and sleep becomes lighter as a result. Some sailors keep small personal items close, a piece of cloth, a tool, a token from home, not for practicality alone, but for comfort, a reminder of something beyond the endless water, something steady, something familiar. Sound is another consideration. Many choose positions slightly away from the busiest areas of the ship, not to escape others completely, but to reduce unnecessary disturbance, yet full silence is never possible. The sea ensures that, even the most carefully chosen sleeping place remains part of a living, moving environment, and so, sailors learn patience, they accept interruption, they accept imperfection, and slowly, they learn to sleep in fragments. Short rest, light rest, rest shaped by necessity rather than ideal conditions. There is also a quiet awareness among the crew. Even while resting, many remain only partially asleep, one ear still tuned to changes in sound, a shift in wind, a change in the creaking of wood, a distant command. This awareness is not fear, but habit, a survival instinct shaped by life at sea. And yet, despite all of this effort, there are moments when sleep arrives more easily, when the sea is calm, when the wind softens, when the ship moves in gentle rhythm beneath a clear sky. In those rare hours, protection becomes less about effort and more about trust. Trust in the vessel, trust in experience, trust in the sea itself. But such moments are never guaranteed, and every sailor knows they are temporary. Because conditions can change with little warning, and preparation, no matter how careful, must always be ready to adjust. As the night deepens once more, the crew settles into their chosen places, carefully, quietly, each man finding his own way to rest within a world that refuses to stand still, and above them, the stars continue their slow, silent journey across the sky, unchanged, unbothered, and endlessly patient. After long days of effort, noise, and constant movement, the sea sometimes offers something unexpected, not silence, not perfection, but a kind of softness that feels almost like permission to breathe more slowly, to move less carefully, and, for a brief moment, to forget the weight of life aboard an ancient warship. These moments never arrive with announcement. They are not planned, not predicted. They simply appear when the world decides to calm itself. The wind slows, not completely still, but gentle enough that the sails no longer strain. The waves lose their sharp edges. They rise and fall in smooth, steady rhythm, and the ship, for once, feels less like a restless object and more like something being carried. Inside this rare atmosphere, even the crew changes, movements become unhurried, voices soften without instruction, even the usual tension in the air seems to loosen slightly. Sailors continue their tasks, but without urgency. Ropes are checked, equipment is adjusted, supplies are organized, yet everything feels lighter, as if time itself has slowed just enough to be noticed. For those trying to sleep, these moments are especially precious, because rest aboard a warship is usually fragmented, interrupted by sound, motion, or discomfort. But during these rare periods of calm, sleep becomes deeper, more natural. Almost unforced, men lie down where they are, not carefully choosing positions this time, but simply allowing exhaustion to settle them wherever they happen to be, on open deck, near folded sails, beside softly swaying ropes. Even the wooden surface beneath them feels different in such moments, less harsh, less demanding. The mind, too, begins to quiet, thoughts drift more slowly, memories of home no longer feel distant or painful, but gentle, like something carried on the same soft wind moving across the sea. Some sailors remain awake during these moments, not out of duty, but out of appreciation. They look out toward the horizon, watching light shift across water that finally resembles peace rather than uncertainty. the Mediterranean, so often unpredictable, can sometimes appear almost harmless, a vast open space of silver and blue, reflecting the sky above with surprising calm. In these hours, even the ship's sounds change, wood still creaks, but softly, ropes still sway, but without strain, water still touches the hull, but like a quiet conversation rather than a forceful presence. It is not true silence, but something more forgiving. And perhaps that is why it feels so rare, because nothing aboard an ancient warship remains gentle for long. The sea always remembers its nature, and the ship always remembers its purpose, yet these brief intervals of peace become deeply important. They allow bodies to recover slightly, minds to loosen their constant alertness, and spirits, however briefly, to feel something close to ease. Sailors often remember these moments more clearly than the harsh ones, not because they last longer, but because they feel different from everything else, a pause in struggle, a breath between challenges, a reminder that the sea is not only a place of hardship, but also of quiet beauty. As evening approaches again, the calm slowly begins to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually. The wind returns with more presence, the water regains its texture, the ship resumes its familiar rhythm of motion, and with it, the awareness of uncertainty quietly returns. But for a short while longer, as light fades across the horizon, the world remains gentle, and sleep, for those fortunate enough to find it in time, arrives without resistance, carried by a sea that, for once, asks for nothing in return. As the sun begins its slow descent once again, casting long shadows across the endless Mediterranean, the warship continues forward, steady and unshaken on the surface. But beneath that calm movement, there is a deeper truth that follows every journey across these ancient waters, because every voyage demanded something in return, not only from the ship, not only from the sea, but from the men who lived within it. Sacrifice, for ancient sailors, was not a single moment, it was a continuous condition, something woven into every hour of life at sea. They sacrificed comfort first. The idea of a soft bed became distant, replaced by wooden planks that never softened. They sacrificed privacy, every thought, every habit, every restless night shared in close proximity with others. They sacrificed silence, because the ship never truly stopped speaking, through creaks, waves, wind, and movement, and in return for all this, they gained something far less tangible, a place within something larger than themselves, a vessel that moved through the world with purpose, across coastlines, across cultures, across distant horizons that most people would never see. Many sailors left behind familiar lives before stepping aboard, homes that once felt permanent, faces that once felt close, lives that continued without them as the ship slowly drifted away from shore. And even though they knew this would happen, knowing never made it easier. Memory remained, not loudly, but quietly, beneath daily tasks, in brief pauses between commands, in moments of exhaustion when the mind softened. Some remembered families waiting inland, others remembered fields, workshops, or small coastal towns that now felt far away. And yet, the ship required full attention. There was no space to live in two worlds at once, only the present mattered. The sea demanded it. Time itself seemed to change aboard these vessels. Days were measured not by comfort, but by tasks completed, by wind survived, by distance traveled, by nights endured, and within that structure, sacrifice became normalized, not glorified, not celebrated, but accepted as something necessary, even routine. Still, there were moments when the weight of it became visible, a sailor staring too long at the horizon, a quiet conversation that ends without resolution, a pause in movement that lasts just a little too long. These small gestures carried unspoken meaning, because everyone understood what had been given up and what could not easily be returned, yet the ship continued to function. Because collective sacrifice created something powerful, a unity formed not through comfort, but through shared endurance. Every man depended on the others, every action supported the whole. Even sleep, fragmented and imperfect, became part of this shared system. Rest was not individual escape, it was collective maintenance, a way for the body to continue serving the ship as the vessel moved through calm waters or uncertain seas. This silent agreement remained constant: we endure together, or not at all, and in that understanding, a strange kind of bond formed, not warm in the way of friendship alone, but steady, practical, deeply rooted in necessity. As evening light spreads across the water once more, and the ship casts its long shape across the waves, the idea of sacrifice becomes less abstract, it becomes visible in tired faces, in worn hands, in quiet breathing beneath the stars, and in every small act that keeps the ship moving forward, because nothing aboard an ancient warship came without cost, and nothing continued without those willing to pay it. As the night settles once again over the ancient Mediterranean, and the warship continues its steady journey through darkness, the story begins to shift in a subtle but important way, because behind every known battle, behind every recorded victory, behind every name carved into stone or written in history, there were countless others who were never remembered: the ordinary sailors, the rowers, the laborious of the sea, the men who lived their lives between wooden planks and endless horizons. They did not appear in grand speeches, they were not painted in heroic portraits, their names were rarely written down with care, and yet, without them, none of the famous stories would have existed at all. Every empire that crossed the Mediterranean relied on their strength, every commander who stood on a victorious deck depended on their endurance, every ship that returned to harbor did so because they carried it forward, stroke by stroke, night after night. But history often remembers only the surface, the leaders, the strategies, the moments of triumph. What remains hidden is the continuous human effort beneath it all. The quiet repetition of labor that made movement possible. These forgotten sailors lived lives defined not by recognition, but by routine, waking before dawn, working through changing winds, sleeping whenever exhaustion allowed, and repeating the cycle again. There was no pause in the system they served, no long rest between journeys for most of them, only shifting assignments, different ships, different routes. But always the same sea. Some joined voluntarily, seeking wages or opportunity, others were bound by circumstance, and some were drawn in by forces beyond their control. Yet once aboard, their individual stories began to blend into a collective existence, not erased, but absorbed into something larger. The ship itself became their world, and the world beyond the ship slowly turned into memory, in quiet moments. When the sea was calm and work temporarily eased, thoughts often drifted inward, to places far from water, to faces no longer seen daily, to lives that continued without them. But such reflections rarely lasted long. The demands of the ship always returned. Because survival required attention, and attention required presence, still, these men shaped history in ways they never witnessed. Their labor connected cities, their endurance supported trade, their movement carried armies across regions that defined entire civilizations, and yet, their experience remained largely invisible in the stories told afterward. Even life aboard the ship itself rarely honored individuals, it honored function. A man was valued for what he could do, not for how his story began, not for where he came from, but for how he contributed to the vessel's survival, and so identity became quiet, practical, almost dissolved into the rhythm of the sea. But even within this anonymity, humanity remained, in shared exhaustion, in brief conversations during calm evenings, in moments of silence where understanding passed without words. These were not grand gestures, but they were real, and they mattered. As the ship moves forward under a sky filled with distant stars, it carries more than wood, sails, and supplies. It carries stories that were never fully written, lives that were never fully recorded, and people who existed at the very center of history, without ever being placed at its surface. The sea does not distinguish between the remembered and the forgotten. It moves with both, equally, indifferently. And as night deepens once again, the warship continues onward, not just through water, but through layers of time itself. As the night deepens over the Mediterranean for what feels like the final time, the warship continues its endless journey through waters that have already seen so much. But something begins to change, not in the sea itself, but in the way it is being perceived. The wooden deck still creaks, the sails still shift softly with the wind, the waves still rise and fall in their ancient rhythm, and yet, everything feels further away, softer. As if the ship is no longer only moving through water, but through memory itself. Sleep arrives differently now, not as a struggle, not as a fragile attempt to escape discomfort, but as a slow surrender to exhaustion that has been building across countless nights. Sailors lie where they are, as they have done before, between ropes, beside wooden beams, under the faint glow of lantern light that sways gently with the motion of the sea. Their breathing blends with the sound of water against the hull, and slowly, even the boundaries between body and ship begin to fade. It is no longer clear where the men end, and where the vessel begins. The ship carries them forward without resistance, as if it has always known this path. As if every storm, every calm night, every difficult hour was leading to this quiet continuation. Above deck, the stars remain unchanged, ancient and distant, watching without judgment. Below them, the Mediterranean stretches endlessly. A world that has carried civilizations, dreams, and forgotten lives across its surface. Everything feels connected now, not through history books, not through names or dates, but through motion, through repetition, through the simple act of drifting forward. In this stillness, it becomes easier to imagine how time itself behaves at sea, not as a straight line, but as layers, stacked one over another, each voyage overlapping the last. Each sailor unknowingly walking paths already taken by those before them, and those who will come after. The warship becomes more than wood and rope. It becomes a vessel of echoes, carrying not only men, but the memory of every journey it has ever made. The sleeping sailors do not notice this shift. To them, there is only rest, only the slow weight of exhaustion finally giving way to peace. But something larger seems present in the silence, as if the sea is remembering them in return, not individually, but collectively, as part of an endless continuation that never fully ends. Even the wind feels distant now, less like a force, more like a breath shared between worlds. And in this space between wakefulness and sleep, the story begins to dissolve, not end, but soften, like a painting slowly blending into the canvas that holds it. The ship continues forward, always forward, yet direction feels less important than the feeling of movement itself. Because perhaps the ancient seas were never just a place to cross, perhaps they were something closer to a threshold, between safety and uncertainty, between presence and memory, between what is known and what is no longer visible. And now, as the final light fades across the horizon, there is a quiet question left behind, not spoken by the sailors, not written in stone, but carried gently by the water itself. If these ships are still moving beneath the surface of history, if these nights still exist somewhere beyond time, then who is truly dreaming, the ones who lived them, or the ones who are still imagining them now? And as the Mediterranean drifts into silence once more, the answer remains just out of reach, somewhere beneath the waves, waiting.